Your comments about Christian existentialism, as you very carefully explained what you meant by that term, immediately makes me think of Dostoevsky, who not only in Notes from the Underground, but I'm particularly thinking of the brothers Karamazov and in Crime and Punishment, two of his novels in which he suggests very much the same thing, the tremendous importance of a purification of self, of a definition of self, and that out of this comes a concept of Christianity which is very forceful, but it requires along the way a tremendous amount of suffering, a tremendous amount of self-examination, a peeling away of worldly facades and poses and self-deceptions. So could we, for a few moments, or could you for a few moments, comment on the concept of Christianity, which we find in someone like Dostoevsky, who seems to be approaching this question of self-deception, this question of self-purification, in very much the same way that Kierkegaard did?
One thing that's important to keep in mind before we talk about Dostoevsky, and I'm happy to talk about him, is that for various reasons, some of which I've mentioned earlier, it would, to my mind, be a mistake and unfruitful to call Dostoevsky an existentialist. Similarly, I would not call Nietzsche an existentialist any more than I would call Aristotle a Thomist. No Thomism without Aristotle, but that doesn't make Aristotle a Thomist. No existentialism without Nietzsche, but that doesn't make Nietzsche an existentialist. But I will come back to Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky had a great influence on 20th century existentialism, and so, incidentally, also did Tolstoy. And before we talk about Dostoevsky now, it is well to keep in mind that one of the distinctive things about 20th century existentialism is that it is a movement against positivism. Positivism consists largely in philosophers, and for that matter people in some of the other humanities, modeling themselves on the sciences, making science the norm. That is the essence of positivism. And existentialism is very much against that, and it is prophetic in a way when Kierkegaard calls one of his major works, concluding unscientific postscript. When he spoke of unscientific, he was not only thinking of the natural sciences, but also of Hegel's boast, the German philosopher's boast, that he had elevated philosophy to the rank of a science. But a certain bias against science is built into 20th century existentialism, and particularly strong in the work of Martin Heidegger. And it is important, I think, to realize that although Heidegger is not a theist, while Kierkegaard was so Christian, in very important respects, Heidegger is really very, very close to Kierkegaard. Now, one thing that distinguishes 20th century existentialism is not only a certain bias against science, but also a strong feeling that philosophy really is closer to literature, and quite especially to poetry, than it is to the sciences. And what goes together with this strong affinity for literature is, of course, in the case of Jean-Paul Sartre, a great literary genius, the gift to really write great literature, which Sartre has done again and again in various genres. But what goes with it too is that Sartre, as well as Jaspers and Heidegger and some other writers who are in some respects close to them, have been very much influenced by various literary figures. And among these literary figures, Dostoevsky is very important. Now, there are a number of motifs in Dostoevsky that have had considerable influence, and I don't think that as far as the existentialist writers are concerned, it was anything that has very much to do with his Christianity. I think that Dostoevsky's strong Christian convictions have not been that influential on Jaspers or Heidegger or Sartre, perhaps not at all. But one thing that's very striking about Dostoevsky, not so much perhaps to somebody who is young now and takes that sort of thing for granted, but what was very striking for these writers is Dostoevsky's psychological acuteness. Nietzsche first discovered Dostoevsky in 1887, quite fortuitously, by chance, picking up a book, it was Notes from Underground, in a French translation, in a bookstore, and then in the following year, writing one of his own books, he referred to Dostoevsky with great admiration and called him the only psychologist, by the way, who had something to teach me. And this, I think, is what helps to account for Dostoevsky's great influence on 20th century existentialism, his psychological insights. And that incidentally goes for Tolstoy too. Tolstoy's short story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, so much anticipates some of what the existentialists have been saying about man sweating out his own death, that I would say that Heidegger in particular, in his discussion of death in his major philosophical work, Being and Time, offers us an unacknowledged commentary on the death of Ivan Ilyich by Tolstoy. He does once in passing mention this work, but he does not make explicit how great his indebtedness is to it. And what we find even outside the death of Ivan Ilyich in Tolstoy is, in Anna Karenina, for example, a masterful understanding of the mechanisms of self-deception. I have tried to bring this out in the long introduction to an anthology I've done, Religion from Tolstoy to Camus, published in paperback by Harper Torch Books. And there I try to show in some detail how in Anna Karenina we do find a really profound understanding of self-deception and document how this is one of the motifs that runs through the book. Now this is very relevant in connection with existentialism because self-deception is one of the main motifs in Jean-Paul Sartre's work. He uses the French phrase mauvaise foi, literally bad faith, but this is all but indistinguishable from self-deception. And he does not only discuss this in his Being and Nothingness, in which a whole chapter deals with mauvaise foi, with bad faith, but of course he also offers a very intricate anatomy of bad faith in his plays and in his short stories and in his novels. And while perhaps nowhere in Dostoevsky do we find really something quite as persistent on this theme as we do, I think, in Anna Karenina, Dostoevsky is another writer from whom one can learn a tremendous amount about the psychological subtleties of self-deception.
I didn't mean to suggest earlier that Dostoevsky was an existentialist any more than I would suggest that in, let's say, King Lear, where Lear races out into the heath. He's going mad, and he pulls away his clothes. He tries to strip away his mortality. I don't mean to suggest in citing that situation that either Shakespeare or King Lear is an existentialist. But what intrigues me, and I think what intrigues my students, is the process of self-examination. And earlier in our conversation, you were talking about the four philosophers and their starting point. And it seems to me that so many things that you have said to this point suggest that the process of self-inquiry whether the ultimate recognition is a recognition of God or the recognition of no God. Either way, whatever the conclusion might be, nevertheless, man himself undergoes this process of self-examination. He undergoes this stripping away of certain vestiges of his humanity to get to his essential humanity. That deception is part of humanity, self-deception and deception of others. So could I come back to this point just a little bit further and ask you to comment on the process by which man, whether it is man in Dostoevsky's view or man in Heidegger's view or whoever, by which man seeks to explore himself, certainly not a new idea, and what conclusions he reaches about other men, having once examined himself.
Persistent self-examination clearly is not a sufficient condition for calling anybody an existentialist. I have no doubt that some people would like only too well calling Oedipus Tyrannus in Sophocles' great play, also called King Oedipus, an existentialist figure, but I would not. Here we have the stripping away of layers of misapprehension and an attempt to finally recognize what one is oneself. But I would say that does not make him an existentialist. A very clear example that this is not enough to make somebody an existentialist would be Sigmund Freud. Surely Freud is the man who has done more than any other single human being to usher in an era in which all of us are aware of the ubiquity of self-deception, in which all of us realize how difficult it is to be honest with oneself. And Freud has given us more guidance than anybody else toward really understanding ourselves, but we don't therefore call Freud an existentialist. As I've suggested before, what is distinctive in existentialism is that all this is considered the best starting point for philosophy. And so what makes Jaspers and Heidegger and Sartre existentialists is that this is for them the starting point, but from there they go on to develop philosophies. And these philosophies are somewhat different in all three cases.